By the time the first pickup rolled through Mara Ellison's gate that August morning, the sun was already the wrong color. Not yellow, not white. Copper. The kind of copper that only shows up when the sky is full of smoke, and the valley knows it before the radio says it out loud. Mara was standing at the north fence, with dust on her jeans and a coil of polywire over one shoulder, when she heard the truck tires crunch over lava gravel. She didn't turn right away. She kept her eyes on the herd below her. 36 buffalo now, broad-backed and dark against the pale gold of the basin, moving in a tight line through a strip of cheatgrass they had nearly shaved to the dirt. A year earlier, half the county had laughed when she brought home 28 fevered animals no one else would touch. Now 3 ranch trucks were parked outside her house before breakfast. The first man out was Boyd Hanley, who had once stood outside the feed store and told anybody who would listen that Mara Ellison had finally lost her mind. This morning, his hat was in his hands. "There's a fire over by Juniper Fold," he said. "Wind's carrying it east." Mara nodded once. "I heard." Boyd swallowed. "Creed's south pasture is already spotting. If it crosses the dry draws, it'll jump fence to the whole basin." Another truck door slammed. Then another. Men climbed out slowly, none of them eager to be first. They looked different at her gate than they had a year ago. Less amused, less certain. Smoke did that to people. Fire stripped a man down faster than poverty ever could. Finally, Boyd said what none of them wanted to say. "We need your herd." Mara shifted the coil on her shoulder and looked past him at the others. Men who had filmed her stock trailer when the buffalo first came in. Men who had called them plague cattle. Men who had said she was trying to play rancher on borrowed land and widow grit. Behind them, the wind changed, and everybody looked west at once. A dark bruise was rising over the ridge. Not cloud, smoke. "We need you to move them across the basin road," Boyd said. "If they can hammer down the cheatgrass and those coulees before the main front turns, we might still hold a line." Might. That word sat between them like a tin cup with nothing in it. Mara looked back at the herd. The lead cow lifted her head. One torn ear. White scar down the bridge of her nose. The same cow who had nearly died the first week on the ranch. Eli called her Bramble. Dr. June Mercer called her impossible. Tom Varela just called her smart enough to make men uncomfortable. The herd bunched behind Bramble, moving the way Mara had taught them over months of dust, patience, salt, whistle cues, and pressure release lanes. They weren't tame. They were never going to be tame. But they knew her roots. They knew her flags. They knew how to turn hard and move fast through country cattle hated. Boyd cleared his throat. "Mara?" She let him wait. That was part of it too. A year ago, no one had waited for her answer. Now they were standing in her yard with smoke on the horizon like schoolboys outside a principal's office. Across the field, her 11-year-old son Eli came running from the pump shed, thin as a fence post and just as wiry, his red bandana hanging loose around his neck. "They're saying the fire jumped the service road," he said, breathless. Then he saw the trucks, the ranchers, the hats in their hands, and stopped. He understood immediately. Kids always did. Boyd looked at Mara again. "Name your price." That almost made her laugh. Not because it was funny. Because a year earlier, the county had agreed on exactly what her judgment was worth, and the number had been close to 0. She set the coil on the fence post, wiped her hands on her jeans, and said, "Before I name anything, you're going to hear how we got here." The men glanced at one another, impatient and ashamed at the same time. Mara didn't care. If they wanted the herd, they were going to stand in the smoke and listen. Because a year ago, nobody had listened when she said the animals weren't finished. And if Boyd Hanley wanted her buffalo now, then he was going to understand exactly what he was asking for. It had started in April, at a quarantine yard 40 miles west of Harrow Basin, on a day when the wind smelled like iodine, old hay, and public humiliation. And even then, before the fever broke, before the spring came up from the rock, before the first green stripe cut through dead cheatgrass, the herd had already known something the humans didn't. The question was whether Mara should have trusted that instinct, or whether buying them had been the most reckless mistake of her life. The county called it a liquidation. People in Harrow Basin called it a circus collapse. The place had once been sold to tourists as Sage Frontier Safari, a private drive-through park where visitors could pay to take pictures of exotic hoofstock against the Oregon desert and pretend they were on a frontier adventure. Then the owner got buried in fraud charges, unpaid feed bills, and a transport scandal so ugly the county stopped using the word mismanagement and started using investigation. By the time the gates opened for the livestock dispersal, nobody wanted what was left. Not the camels, not the zebra hybrids, not the half-broken trailers, and definitely not the buffalo. They were penned off in the back quarantine yard, behind rusted pipe rails and sun-bleached tarps that snapped in the wind like gunshots. 28 animals, too thin, too rough-coated, eyes hot from transport stress and fever. Several with patches of hair rubbed raw on the shoulder where they'd crowded too hard against bad fencing. Men walked past the pen, looked once, and kept walking. Respiratory mess, one said. Transport fever, another muttered. Lawsuit with hooves. Mara had not driven out there for buffalo. She had driven out there for a used stock tank, 2 gate panels, and maybe a spool of salvaged wire if the bidding stayed low enough. Her ranch sat on 112 acres at the ragged edge of Harrow Basin, land her father had worked like a man trying to argue with drought, and almost winning. After he died, she inherited the ground and the debt together, which was about as fair as life ever got. The last 3 years had been a rotation of repairs, side jobs, missed sleep, and arithmetic that never stayed friendly for long. She didn't have room in her life for a miracle. She definitely didn't have room for 28 half-sick buffalo. Then she saw how they were standing. Not scattered, not frantic, not broken. Grouped. The weaker yearlings were inside the ring. The heavier cows were outside, not feeding, not sleeping, just watching. One lifted her head every few seconds toward the north fence, where there was nothing but basalt ridge and cheatgrass beyond it. Mara stood still, one hand hooked in her belt. Animals under real collapse often lost structure first. They went loose in the mind before they went loose in the body. But these animals still had rules. Even sick, they were holding a shape. A man beside her snorted. "You thinking of buying a graveyard?" Mara didn't answer. She stepped closer to the rail. One buffalo turned toward her. Broad forehead, left ear torn halfway down, scar on the nose. The cow didn't lunge, didn't flinch either. Just watched her with the kind of flat, old intelligence that made people uncomfortable because it didn't ask anything from them. Then, as a truck backfired on the far lot, half the herd shifted, not away from the noise, but toward the north edge of the pen. Together, as if the wind had told them something. That was what snagged inside Mara's mind. Not pedigree, not pity, direction. "What's beyond that ridge?" she asked the yard manager. He shrugged. Basalt wash, old county cut, nothing. The man said nothing too quickly. Mara filed that away. When the buffalo lot finally came up, the auctioneer's energy changed. So did the crowds. People got louder whenever they wanted distance from risk. Sarcasm cost nothing. 28 American buffalo, the auctioneer said. Quarantine release pending vet clearance. Sold as is. Full load only. Buyer responsible for haul out by sunset tomorrow. Nobody lifted a hand. The opening bid came cheap. So cheap, it almost felt like a dare. Mara felt her chest tighten, the way it always did when life laid a decision in front of her that was either very stupid or very important, maybe both. That was when Dalton Creed arrived. He came in late enough to be noticed and slow enough to suggest he didn't care whether he was noticed or not. Tall, broad, silver-buckled, perfectly pressed. The kind of man who looked born leaning against polished truck doors and telling county boards what reality should cost. He ran Creed Livestock, chaired 2 local committees, and had a habit of speaking as if public opinion were just another gate he knew how to unlatch. When he saw Mara at the rail, he smiled the way some men smiled at a match dropped near dry grass. "Ellison," he said, "you shopping above your weight class?" "I'm standing," Mara said, "not shopping." A few men laughed. Dalton stepped close enough that she caught cedar cologne over feed dust. "Good, because if you buy those things, you'll need a veterinarian, a lawyer, and a priest, in that order." The auctioneer called again. Still nothing. Mara looked at the herd one more time. Their eyes were bright, but not glazed. Their nostrils were wet. They were stressed, yes. Fevered, yes. But there was fight in them. And that pull toward the north edge of the pen gnawed at her harder than it had any right to. She raised her paddle. The sound in the yard changed instantly. Not loud. Worse. Interested. Dalton's smile widened. Hell of a way to lose a ranch. Nobody bid against her. Not once. The gavel fell, and in the dry April wind of a failed safari park, Mara Ellison became the owner of 28 sick buffalo, and a silence so sharp she could feel it in her teeth. Then the laughter started. Not from everybody. Just enough. Enough to make the purchase feel permanent. Enough to travel faster than the paperwork. Enough that by the time Mara reached her truck, 2 people were already filming, and one man had posted "Single mom buys plague buffalo" before she'd even started the engine. Dalton leaned one arm against her driver's door. "You know what's funny?" he said quietly. Mara kept her hand on the handle and waited him out. "I was going to buy them for disposal value if they cleared transport cheap enough. Hide, meat, tax write-down, who knows? But you just saved me the trouble." He tipped his head toward the pen. "Now when they die on your place, they'll take your mortgage with them." He stepped back, amused with himself. Mara opened the door. But before she climbed in, she looked once more toward the quarantine yard. All 28 buffalo had shifted again. North, as if something beyond the fence was still calling them. Mara got in the truck and shut the door on the laughter. By the time she hit the county road, she had less than 24 hours to move the herd. No proper buffalo fencing, no extra feed ordered, and almost no cash left after the bid. And somewhere behind the panic, one question kept driving beside her. Why had Dalton cared enough to come over and talk? Mockery in a small county traveled the way wildfire did. It found dry places first. By evening, Harrow Basin had already built a story out of her. At the gas station, she heard 2 men by the freezer saying she'd bite herself a lawsuit. At the feed store, someone asked if she planned to keep the buffalo in her kitchen. By nightfall, a local Facebook page had clipped footage of her trailer backing up to the quarantine yard, and titled it, "When Pride Outbids Common Sense." Mara did what people with no margin always did. She kept moving. Tom Varela agreed to help with the haul if she repaired his pump line before summer. Tom was 68, raw-boned, sunburnished, and so stingy with words that when he offered 6 at once, you knew he meant them. "Bad idea," he told her, tightening a chain on the trailer gate. "But I've had worse." That was Tom's version of loyalty. Dr. June Mercer came out before dawn the next morning, dark braid under a cap, stethoscope around her neck, sleeves already rolled above the elbow. June had worked large animal medicine from Burns to Bend, and had the calm manner of someone who had seen too much panic to contribute any of her own. She climbed the rail, watched the buffalo 20 minutes, then said, "They're sick, but not finished. Mara nearly sagged from relief. June held up a finger. Don't get hopeful too fast. Stress fever, dehydration, probable parasite load, possible secondary pneumonia in 2 or 3. If you overfeed them, you could kill them. If you move them too hard, you could break them. If your fencing fails, they'll turn your week into a lawsuit. Anything else? June looked at her. Yeah. Why did you buy them? Mara surprised herself by telling the truth. They kept orienting to the north fence. June stared, then gave one short laugh. That's either the smartest thing you've ever noticed, or the dumbest reason anybody's ever spent money. Mara had no defense, so she settled for helpful. By late afternoon, the buffalo were on the road to her ranch in 2 rough, dusty loads, dark hulks shifting against steel, the trailers creaking over washboard county lanes. Eli stood at the gate when they arrived, all elbows and worry, baseball gloves still hanging from one hand because she had pulled him out of practice to help set markers. He stared at the first buffalo stepping into the holding pasture and whispered, "They're huge." "They're sick," Mara said, "so stay where I can see you." He nodded, though his eyes never left the animals. The first 3 days were ugly. The herd came in hot, defensive, and exhausted. 2 cows coughed thick. 1 yearling went down on her knees and stayed there long enough to make Mara think she had just bought a pile of regret and freight bills. The fence rattled twice under pressure before Tom and Mara reinforced the corners with old railroad ties her father had kept behind the barn. Nobody slept much. June came twice a day. Salt, electrolyte water, slow feed rough hay, mineral correction, deworming sequence, fever watch, keep them quiet, don't crowd, don't force, don't panic. The work would have been enough on its own, but Dalton Creed made sure it wasn't. On the second evening, a county truck came by to verify that Mara had proper holding infrastructure for large ungulates under temporary quarantine conditions. On the third, the feed supplier who had promised her an emergency hay load called back to say a larger client had purchased the available reserve. Mara didn't ask which client. She already knew. That same night, Eli came in from the porch with his tablet and held it out wordlessly. Someone had posted drone footage of the buffalo in Mara's pasture. The caption read, "She bought a disaster." Watch how this ends. For one dangerous second, Mara wanted to throw the tablet across the room. Instead, she put it face down on the table and told Eli to wash up for dinner. He stood still. What if they're right? That was the problem with public ridicule. It was never aimed only at the person being mocked. It seeped into the walls, the kitchen, the silence. Mara crouched so they were eye level. Then we'll be wrong after trying, she said. Not wrong because we listened. Eli studied her face, looking for the part she didn't believe. Then he nodded and went to the sink. That night, long after Eli was asleep, Mara walked the fence with a flashlight and heard it again. Not panic, not random movement, but a repeated drift of the herd toward the north draw. Even the sickest animals kept edging that way. There was almost no feed there. No water trough, no shelter worth naming, just basalt outcrop and a long fold of ground her father used to call Crow's Cut. Mara stood in the dark, listening to the buffalo breathe. Then, from somewhere out in the north pasture, came the sound of rock shifting under hooves. And for the first time, she wondered whether the herd had not just survived something, whether they were trying to find something. The worst night came on a Thursday, 5 days after the herd arrived. Wind pressed low against the house. The trough heater clicked on and off. One of the younger cows spiked hard and staggered into the corner panel, sides pumping. June got there in 22 minutes. Mara knew because Eli had written the time on the whiteboard by the phone, like that might make the waiting smaller. They worked under portable floodlights, shadows cut long across the mud. June dosed. Mara held lanes open. Tom drove in just before midnight with an extra panel and a thermos strong enough to strip paint.
At one point, the torn-eared cow charged the gate line, stopped 3 feet short, and spun back toward the sick yearling, planting herself between the others and the downed animal like a sentry with horns. June saw it too. "Interesting," she murmured. "Good interesting? No idea yet." By 2 in the morning, the worst of the fever broke. June leaned against the rail and rubbed the bridge of her nose. If they were quitters, they'd already be dead. Mara looked across the holding pasture. Even spent, the herd was angled toward the north draw. "You still think that matters?" June asked. "I think they do."
The next morning, Mara found Eli at the table before sunrise, drawing a map on butcher paper. Not roads, not fences. Paths. Lines showing where the buffalo had drifted at dusk, midnight, dawn. He had marked the north draw darker than the rest. "They don't go there by accident," he said. Mara poured coffee and sat beside him. "You were supposed to be asleep." "I was." Then Bramble hit the panel. "You named one?" He shrugged. "She looks like a bramble." Mara wanted to correct him, tell him not to get attached, tell him they were still 1 bad week away from losing animals and maybe the ranch. But she stopped herself. Kids growing up around uncertainty learned to love carefully. That didn't mean they loved less. It meant they paid closer attention. The next days settled into a brutal routine. Fever checks, fence checks, calls about overdue accounts she stopped answering once the numbers started sounding like accusations. Dalton's name came up everywhere without him needing to be there. On hay, on county complaints, on a rumor that the buffalo had already tested positive for something dangerous, which June shut down so hard at the diner one morning that the entire room went quiet around her coffee cup. Yet even while the county talked, the pasture started telling a different story. The herd was eating. Slowly at first, then with intention. They were using the land in strange, concentrated pulses, hammering one patch, ignoring another, circling back to ground Mara would have sworn had nothing left worth taking. Their hooves broke the hard crust in shallow patterns. Their wallows gathered the previous night's drizzle in little mirrored pockets. Tom squatted in the field one evening, pinched a tuft of grass, and grunted. "What?" Mara asked. "Seen cattle miss land like this for years," he said. "These devils don't miss much." That should have felt like a victory. Instead, it felt like the start of a different question. Because every evening, when the heat bled off the basin and the shadows stretched long, the herd would begin drifting north again. Not all the way to the fence, not crashing it, just assembling there, heads lifted, sniffing, waiting. On the 7th day, Eli came running back from the upper draw with dirt on both knees and his inhaler bouncing against his shirt. "Mom," he said, "come here, right now." Mara dropped the fence pliers and followed him. He took her past the outer posts, through brittle sage, up the shallow cut where the basalt came through the soil in dark ribs. The buffalo were below them, all 28, packed along the lower swale in an arc, watching uphill. Eli pointed at a crack between 2 lava shelves half hidden by rabbit brush. At first, Mara saw nothing. Then she knelt. A thread of air touched her face. Cold. Not breeze, not evening cooling. Cold air rising from underground. Tom arrived a minute later, breathing hard from the climb. He crouched by the fracture, ran his knuckles across the rock, then looked at Mara with a different face than she had seen at the auction or the trailer or any night since. "Well," he said, "that shouldn't be here." The buffalo below them went silent all at once, as if they had been waiting for the humans to catch up. The crack in the basalt was barely wide enough to admit Mara's forearm, but the air coming out of it was unmistakable, cool, damp, and steady even at noon. Tom came back with a pry bar. Eli brought the garden spade. Mara brought hope she refused to call hope out loud.
They spent half a day stripping brush and loose rock from the slope until the opening widened into a collapsed seam, then a pocket, then something stranger. Old stacked stone under the dirt, man-laid and nearly swallowed by the hill. Tom sat back on his heels. This isn't natural. Mara brushed away more soil with both hands. How old? Old enough that the county forgot it. By sunset, they had exposed a shallow intake trench leading into the rock. Not a tunnel exactly, more like a buried collection line, hand-built to catch seep water coming off the basalt and carry it downhill by grade. A spring corridor. Not large, not dramatic. No cinematic waterfall hidden in the desert. Something better. Something real. Water. Slow and stubborn, moving in the dark below her pasture, while half the basin spent summer praying over wells. June came out the next morning, climbed the draw, and stared at the seep collection like Mara had personally dug up a second moon.
"You bought sick buffalo," she said, "and somehow ended up with hydrology." Mara laughed for the first time in days, not because anything was solved, because for 1 second, the universe seemed too weird not to. They cleared enough stone to prove the channel still carried flow. Not much, but enough to matter. Enough that if Mara could capture it cleanly, line a storage tank and pump it carefully, the north pasture might carry through July without tanker trips. There was, of course, a catch. There was always a catch. The old collection trench ran close to a service track that crossed into leased ground Dalton Creed used for seasonal cattle movement, which meant if he decided the seep touched his side or interfered with his access, he would turn it into a war before Mara finished her first shovel pass. Tom spat into the dust. "Don't tell him yet." Mara looked at him. "That ever worked for anybody in this county?" "No," Tom said, "but it'll feel good for an afternoon." Eli, meanwhile, had become obsessed with the find. He dug through his grandfather's shed and emerged with faded survey stakes, old county plat copies, and a notebook full of hand-sketched map lines.
Mara's father had marked water the way some men marked graves, carefully, privately, and as if names mattered. One hand-drawn note near Crow's Cut read, "Cold line under basalt. Seasonal above, steady below. Buffalo no before cattle." Mara read it twice, then a third time. Her father had known. Maybe not all of it, maybe not how to rebuild it, but enough to leave the note. Enough to notice what the buffalo had noticed now. That evening, Mara walked back down to the pasture and watched the herd spread across the north side, calmer than they had been anywhere else on the ranch. Some fed, some rolled in the dust. Bramble stood nearest the slope, ears forward, looking up toward the rock seam as if she had been right all along. Mara rested her forearms on the fence. "All right," she murmured. "What else do you know?" The answer came faster than she expected, because once Mara rigged a temporary line from the seep to a small tank and opened the north paddock for timed rotations, the herd began using the land differently, deliberately. They moved through cheatgrass patches like they had a map, not neatly, not politely, but effectively. They hit the flashy, invasive growth before seed shatter. They stomped old crust. They opened bare soil where Tom swore nothing good had grown in years. After a light June rain, tiny green threads began showing in their wake. Native bunch grass. Not everywhere, not enough for a miracle. Enough for a question. June crouched to inspect one strip and said, "If you tell anybody I'm impressed, I'll deny it." Tom grunted. "She's impressed." June ignored him. "This could work, Mara. But if it works, people will want a reason that doesn't make them feel stupid." "Meaning?" "Meaning they won't say you were observant. They'll say you got lucky." Mara looked across the field where Eli was setting bright marker flags along the next rotation lane. "Maybe I was lucky," she said. June stood and brushed off her jeans. "Luck doesn't keep daily records." Mara did keep records. Every move, every grazing block, every cough, heat spell, and water draw. Because when you had no status, records were the closest thing to armor. And she was going to need armor sooner than she thought, because Dalton Creed finally heard about the water. And unlike the men who laughed at the auction, Dalton didn't laugh when something turned out useful. He moved to own it. Dalton came in a white dually with county dust on the fenders and false concern already loaded in his voice. He didn't get out right away, just sat there a moment studying the north pasture where the buffalo were packed into a fresh strip, heads down, moving with that steady, pressure-driven rhythm Mara had spent weeks teaching them. Then he opened the door and stepped down, smiling. "I hear you found yourself a seep." Mara kept the gate chain in her hand. "I hear you still get your news before the people living on my land do." Dalton chuckled. "No need to be prickly. I came as a neighbor." "You came as a witness." His eyes flicked once to the temporary tank line, then back to her. "That service track along the north cut crosses an easement zone my company uses seasonally. If you start trenching or fencing me out, we've got a problem. It's my ground. It's complicated ground." That was Dalton's talent, taking plain facts and wrapping them until they sounded expensive. He walked closer to the fence and nodded toward the buffalo. "Still think these things are your ticket?" "I think they're alive." "Alive isn't profitable." Mara almost smiled. "That why you wanted them at auction?" Dalton's face stilled for half a beat. Then he shrugged. "I buy opportunities. So do you, apparently." He spent 10 more minutes pretending the conversation was about water access and county coordination. It was really about measurement. How much had she found? How much could she defend? How easily could she be frightened back into the version of herself the valley preferred? When he finally drove off, Tom emerged from behind the pump shed where he had been repairing a hose and said, "He's worried." "About the seep?" Tom shook his head. "About you being right in public." That turned out to be exactly the problem, because within 2 weeks, 2 things became impossible to ignore. First, the buffalo were recovering faster than anyone expected. Their coats deepened, their rib lines softened. Even the roughest yearlings began carrying weight like animals planning to stay. Second, Mara's north pasture stopped looking dead. Not green all over. Harrow Basin did not grant that kind of fantasy. But streaked, alive in places, holding moisture longer. Less cheatgrass flash, more native return. June put Mara in touch with a range ecologist from Bend who came out with a clipboard and skepticism, spent 3 hours on the ground, then called what he saw the most promising accidental restoration pilot in the basin. Accidental. Mara let the word pass. The ecologist explained it simply. Tight rotational impact. Buffalo willing to use coarse forage cattle avoided. Hoof action helping seed-soil contact. Wallows catching scarce rain. Reduced fine, flashy fuel in critical strips. In plain English, the herd was turning neglected ground into something harder to burn. That was when Mara had the idea that changed the story from private survival to public threat. She offered to graze a damaged cheatgrass corridor on a neighbor's place for almost nothing, just enough to cover trucking and labor. The neighbor, Ruthie Kelm, was too practical to laugh. "If it fails," she said, "I'll tell people it was my stupid idea. If it works," Ruthie looked over the fence at Bramble, "then I'll tell them I saw it first." They moved the herd in narrow blocks over 2 brutal weeks of June heat. The buffalo took to the rough draw like it was written into them. They stripped seed heads early, trampled dense thatch, opened space between the flashy stems. After one brief rain, the blackened crust of Ruthie's hillside darkened and held. Not fixed, changed. Enough that Ruthie started telling people maybe Mara's crazy buffalo knew more about the basin than the cattlemen did. That was when the rumor campaign started for real. Anonymous posts, whispered claims, talk at the diner that Mara's herd had lingering disease risk.
That the water from the seep wasn't tested. That buffalo ruined fence lines and spooked cattle markets. That she was turning the valley into an experiment because she liked attention. Mara knew where it came from, even when she couldn't prove it. Dalton didn't need to win arguments. He only needed to make certainty impossible. Then came the road. The shortest access track from Mara's place to the neighboring draws passed over a maintained section Dalton's operation helped fund. A week before Mara's second contract graze, heavy equipment unexpectedly blocked the lane for culvert work. 3 days. 3 critical grazing days while seed heads ripened. Ruthie lost her window. Mara stood at the barricade, staring at the county cones, until Eli said quietly, "He's scared of the herd." She looked down at him. People like Dalton aren't scared of animals. Eli shrugged. No, he's scared of people seeing them work. That landed harder than she expected. Because it was true. The buffalo had become evidence. Not just that Mara wasn't foolish, that the valley had been wrong about what usefulness looked like. And that kind of correction always made the proud desperate. By July, Harrow Basin had split into 3 camps. The first still thought Mara had gotten lucky. The second thought she might be onto something, but preferred to say it privately. The third was Dalton Creed, and Dalton believed that if luck started attracting contracts, it had to be crushed before it became precedent. First came the county letter. Not a shutdown, something more slippery. A notice requesting full review of her temporary water capture improvements, transport procedures, biosecurity handling, and perimeter compliance for non-traditional large livestock operations. Non-traditional. As if the problem were not the herd itself, but the nerve required to make them visible. Then came the tanker delay. Mara still needed supplemental water while she finished lining the seep collection and setting a solar pump. The delivery she had prepaid for didn't show on Thursday, or Friday, or Saturday morning. When she finally reached the dispatcher, he sounded miserable. Creed booked the fleet for dust control and stock ponds, he said. I can get you Monday. Monday was too late. The basin was sitting under a heat dome. The north tank had held, but not enough to carry all 4 paddocks if the herd stayed compressed for fire control grazing. Tom called in favors. Ruthie loaned an old nurse tank. June hauled 2 emergency loads herself after clinic hours. Eli spent that weekend with a hose clamp wrench in his pocket and sunburn across the bridge of his nose. No one said Dalton's name while they worked, but all of them thought it. Sunday night, Mara found Eli sitting on the barn roof. He shouldn't have been up there, and they both knew it. Instead of yelling, she climbed halfway, sat on the ladder top, and waited. The basin lay below them in long bronze folds. Here and there, fields glowed green where money went to pivot irrigation. Everything else looked tired. Do you think Grandpa knew? Eli asked. About the spring? I think he knew enough to write it down and run out of time. Eli pulled at a loose thread on his sleeve. Do you ever get tired of proving things? Mara leaned back against the roof edge. Yes. Then why keep doing it? Because quitting was expensive. Because humiliation didn't pay bills. Because once you saw a chance to change a piece of the world, ignoring it felt worse than failing. Because she wanted him to grow up believing effort mattered, even when it wasn't glamorous. She said only, because some people are counting on me to stop. Eli nodded slowly, as if he understood more than she wanted him to. The next morning, Dalton hit a different nerve. He went on local radio. Not to attack her directly. Men like Dalton rarely got that clumsy in public. Instead, he talked about unverified land management fads, unregulated herd impacts, and the risk of replacing proven cattle practice with emotional storytelling. Mara heard it in Tom's truck and nearly laughed at the phrase, emotional storytelling.
as if drought had not already stripped the valley down to stories men told themselves about control, as if the green strips behind her buffalo were fiction, as if the only thing that made a method valid was whether a man with money had tried it first. That afternoon, Mara got a call from a volunteer fire captain she knew from years earlier. "You still cutting those grazing lanes?" he asked. "Trying to." "You ought to keep trying. We've got fuel load maps that look nasty." She stared at the north pasture where the buffalo were massed in a fresh block, hooves ticking softly in the dry stems. How nasty? There was a pause. Nasty enough that if lightning lands wrong, this whole basin becomes a funnel.
That was the first time the coming fire felt less like fear and more like a date waiting somewhere on the calendar. And it was why Mara said yes when Ruthie called again. Not for a contract, for a favor. "Come cut my west straw anyway," Ruthie said. "No payment. Just if you can." Mara almost refused. She couldn't afford charity. Then she looked at the map Eli had drawn on butcher paper. All those lines between properties, all those cheatgrass veins connecting one ranch to the next like dry fuse wire. No piece of the basin burned alone. "All right," she said, "but we do it my way." That was the day Mara stopped thinking like a woman trying to save her ranch and started thinking like someone trying to redesign a valley before it ignited. Dalton, unfortunately, noticed that too. And when powerful men see a pattern forming that does not center them, they reach for the oldest tool they know: fear. The first strike hit 14 miles away in a juniper draw too small to make the evening report. By midnight, it was out. The second strike landed on state land and smoldered unnoticed for 6 hours before a wind shift exposed it. The third hit dry enough ground to matter. That was the one people remembered. By then, the basin had gone brittle. Cheatgrass cured early. Pond margins shrank to cracked half-moons. Cattle bunched around shade and started looking tired in the hips. Dalton's south lease had already trucked in emergency feed. Mara's ranch was not thriving, but it was holding. The seep line was running into 2 storage tanks now, modest but dependable. The buffalo had cut rotational lanes across her north and west slopes. Green strips remained where they had hit hardest in May and June. Sparse, uneven, real. Then, one afternoon, a drone video started circulating from the county road. Half the valley watched it before dinner. On one side of the fence, Dalton's ungrazed cheatgrass shoulder, high, dry, pale as tinder. On Mara's side, a cropped dark lane where the buffalo had passed 3 weeks earlier. No voiceover, no speech, just comparison. That was worse for Dalton than accusation, because images made people think on their own. At the diner the next morning, 3 ranchers who had mocked her in April were suddenly asking Tom whether buffalo could be moved in contract pulses without destroying perimeter fencing. Tom, who possessed the soul of a man born specifically to answer questions in the most annoying way possible, said, "Depends whether the fencing belongs to somebody with sense." Word spread. Not like fame, like pressure. Mara started getting cautious calls. Could she look at a draw? Could she explain her lane widths? Could she show somebody how she placed portable water? Each call carried the same tone beneath the details. "We're not ready to admit you were right, but we're worried enough to ask anyway." Then the radio tone changed on a Monday afternoon just after 3. A strike. Juniper fold. Wind-driven, heading east. Mara was mending a float valve when the dispatcher's voice came through Tom's handheld, clipped and already tired. She stood up too fast and banged her head on the tank lid. By 5, the horizon was marked. By 6, the smoke column had built. By 7, people were moving stock. Dalton Creed ordered his cattle pushed off the south pasture into holding ground that was already too crowded. Men with water tenders started racing dust behind them. County volunteers laid out maps on truck hoods and pointed at contour lines as if the earth might negotiate. Mara walked her pasture at dusk with Eli and June. The buffalo were restless, not panicked, testing the wind, grouping tighter. June studied the sky. If this front hooks north overnight, the basin's in trouble. Mara already knew. She had the fuel maps in her own head by then. All those untreated draws, all those flashy corridors, all those people who assumed they had more time. Eli tugged her sleeve and pointed west. You can see where ours would slow it. He was right. From the rise above the seep, the grazed lanes showed as darker bands through the pale basin. Subtle, but visible if you knew to look. A pattern, a possible line. Not enough alone, never enough alone, but maybe enough joined to others. The problem was obvious the second it formed in her mind. Her own ranch lanes wouldn't save the basin. The herd would have to move. Across neighboring ground, across road crossings, across the very landowners who had spent months calling the animals a disease risk and a joke. Mara turned to June. If I offered to run them across the Hanley Coulee in the old service break, could it help? June answered instantly. Yes.
Could it help enough? June looked at the smoke, then at the herd, then back at Mara. If you can get permission, water and lanes set up before the wind shifts. 3 conditions, each difficult. Together, almost absurd. Then Tom's radio crackled again with a message from town. County wanted all ranchers at the volunteer station. Mara knew before she went that Dalton would be there. And she knew that if she proposed moving buffalo across half the basin, he would either mock the idea or try to control it. What she did not know yet was which one would be more dangerous.
The volunteer station smelled like coffee, diesel, and fear pressed into denim. Maps covered 2 folding tables. Fire behavior sheets were clipped under magnets. Men who had not said a kind word to Mara in months made room for her anyway when she stepped in. Smoke changed the rules fast. Dalton Creed stood at the far table with one hand braced on a contour map, speaking in that calm, amplified tone men used when they wanted calm mistaken for competence. We hold the county road. Protect structure south. Everything else is secondary. Mara waited until he finished. Then she said, that won't matter if the coulee's light. Half the room turned. Dalton's eyes rested on her without warmth. You have a better plan? I have a partial one. She stepped to the map, laid out her finger along the west draw, Hanley Coulee, service break, North Rim Trail. The worst fuel continuity is here, here, and here. My herd can hit 2 of those by dawn if we move tonight. Someone near the coffee urn actually laughed. Not coolly, reflexively. Mara looked straight at him until the laugh died. Boyd Hanley frowned at the map. You're saying graze a fire line? I'm saying reduce enough fine fuel fast enough that when the front reaches the choke points, crews have a chance. Dalton shook his head. Buffalo are not firefighting equipment. No, Mara said. They're mobile fuel management that doesn't care about your fences or your ego. That landed. Hard. Dalton's jaw tightened. And if they break, scatter, cross the road in smoke? They won't if they're run right. He smiled faintly. You expect this county to gamble on your experiment in the dark? Mara met his stare. You already gambled. You just did it by doing nothing. Silence. June stepped forward then, bless her, all clipped professionalism and zero fear. From a fire behavior standpoint, reduced flashy fuels in those drainage corridors would materially help suppression options. I've seen the Ellison lanes. They're real. Tom added, and her herd'll go where cattle won't. More silence. Then Boyd Hanley said the thing that changed the room. If we don't try, my West Place burns first. No man who cared about land admitted that lightly.
Others began nodding. Not because they loved Mara's idea, because the fire had advanced far enough to make pride expensive. Dalton saw it happening and tried once more. If somebody gets killed moving that herd at night, Mara cut him off. Then don't come.
The room looked at him. That was the moment power shifted. Not much, just enough. By 10:30 p.m., Mara was saddling logistics she never wanted. Portable tanks, temporary lanes, headlamps, reflective posts, 2 trailers, 3 pickup spotters, Tom on the rear flank, Boyd on the crossgate, June leapfrogging water and watching stress, and Eli absolutely not coming past the county crossing no matter how much he argued. He argued anyway. "You can't move Bramble without me," he said at the gate. "I absolutely can. She listens when I whistle." Mara grabbed both his shoulders. "No. Tonight you stay at the pump shed with Ruthie. If the radio fails, you keep the tanks running and the maps dry. That matters." His chin worked once, twice. He hated tears and had since he was 6. Finally, he said, "Bring them back." Mara pressed her forehead briefly to his. "That's the plan." The first push started under a copper moon blurred by smoke. Buffalo moved differently at night. Less spectacle, more force. Dark shoulders gliding through darker grass. Hooves making the ground feel occupied. Bramble took the lead lane without trouble, swinging onto the flagged route as if she had known the county would one day need her to walk straight into other people's disbelief. Mara rode the left flank on a sorrel mare who disliked buffalo on principle. Tom held the rear with his low whistle, an old stock cane. Boyd watched the first road gap with a flashlight trembling in his hand. The herd crossed cleaner than Mara dared hope. Then the wind changed. You could hear it before you felt it. A low moving sound in the cheatgrass. A distant rushing like paper fed too fast into flame. Over the ridge, the smoke column loomed. "Mara!" June shouted from the water truck. "It's pushing faster!" There was no time to debate. Only time to lengthen the lane and keep the herd compressed enough to eat, move. So Mara did the one thing she had learned from months of watching the animals choose their own discipline. She stopped trying to force speed and started shaping direction. Pressure, release, salt block ahead, water angle right, quiet behind, no yelling unless absolutely needed.
Let Bramble find the front, and the others would trust motion more than noise. It worked. For an hour, then 2. By 2:15 a.m., the buffalo had hammered their first corridor and were moving into the second. Men who had mocked the whole idea were now sprinting fence rails, resetting posts, and shining headlights where Mara told them to. Nobody talked much. Work was easier than admitting wonder. Then, at the north service break, disaster almost came anyway. One yearling spooked at a helicopter sweep, clipped a temporary post, and the outside edge of the herd boiled sideways toward a cut bank above the road. Boyd swore. Tom rode hard. Mara saw Bramble hesitate, turn, and swing back across the pressure gap toward the broken edge. The rest followed her. Just like that. Not because Mara commanded it, because the herd still had its own center. By dawn, the second corridor was down. Men stood in the dust, staring at the cropped lane like they were looking at a thing they would later describe badly to their wives, because language always shrank when a certainty cracked open. Then somebody on the ridge radioed the new fire line estimate. The front was coming faster than predicted, and the basin's last real stand would happen at Black Divide.
Black Divide was less a ridge than a hard basalt throat where 3 drainages pinched together before opening toward barns, homes, and winter haystacks. If the fire reached it with full grass under it, it would throw embers into half the valley. If it hit reduced fuel and crews caught a break in the wind, maybe, just maybe, the line would hold. By sunrise, the divide looked like the end of a world. Engines staged below. Volunteer trucks lined the shoulder. Men and women in yellow shirts moving hose. cows bawling in distant holding pens, smoke laying low enough to sting the eyes behind glasses and under hat brims. And there, arriving in separate trucks and dust, were the ranchers who had once laughed at Mara's auction buy, as if they were gathering for a church service they were ashamed to need. Her herd came through the final lane, dark with ash on their backs, and dew turned black at the tips of their coats. June checked Bramble in motion and shouted, "Still good!" Mara hardly heard her. She was looking at the ground ahead. The old service break on Black Divide had been mowed years earlier, then neglected, then forgotten. Flashy fuel had recolonized both sides until it became more decoration than defense. But the center still existed.
Just enough lane to widen. Just enough chance. Tom rode beside her, face blackened at the edges by smoke. One pass? Two if they take water. You asking or praying? Both. They turned the herd into the choke point. This time there was no room for elegance, no long, patient setup, just compressed movement, water staged ahead, mineral lure, flank pressure, and trust built over months coming due all at once. The buffalo lowered into the grass. What happened next looked almost unreal in the smoke light. 36 dark bodies moving shoulder to shoulder through pale fuel, not sprinting, not scattering, just feeding with the dense purpose of animals built to convert land one mouthful at a time. Hooves hit crust, dust rose, seed heads vanished. A dark lane widened behind them. Fire crews took one look and started repositioning. "You've got to be kidding me," a captain muttered. Not disbelieving, just stunned. Dalton Creed arrived during the second pass. Of course he did. He came in a side-by-side, face set hard, two hired men behind him, ash falling on the hood. For a second, Mara thought he had come to help. Then he climbed out and said, "You're crossing onto my lease edge without written clearance." Mara turned so slowly the motion itself felt dangerous. Smoke boiled above them.
Engines were moving. The front could be heard now, a living thing in brush and timber beyond sight. And Dalton Creed wanted paperwork. Boyd Handley, to his everlasting credit, stepped between them first. "Are you out of your damn mind?" Boyd said. Dalton ignored him. "If those animals break and cause loss, I'm not eating it because she wanted attention." That word again. Attention. As if a woman would spend a year fighting fever, drought, and debt for the privilege of being insulted in public. Mara walked up close enough that Dalton had to look directly at the soot on her face. "If this line fails," she said quietly, "you won't have enough lease edge left to argue over." Dalton held her gaze. Then the ridge crew yelled. The first flame front had crested the far draw. All at once the scene fractured into motion. Hose teams, engines repositioning, a dozer shifting line, radio speaking over one another, someone shouting for all civilians back. Mara should have pulled the herd out. That was the safe move. Instead, she looked at the half-finished lane, the ungrazed flare edge, the way the wind was hitting the basalt funnel, and knew safe had already passed them. She whistled once, sharp. Bramble lifted her head.
Mara opened the portable wing and sent the herd into one final short pulse across the hottest strip left. Tom swore, then backed her play, because he was Tom, and loyalty had always outrun caution in him by half a stride. The buffalo moved. The front hit 15 minutes later. Flame ran fast through the untreated shoulder, then faltered where the grazed lane widened over rock and broken thatch. Not stopped, nothing so clean, but checked, lowered, broken into pieces crews could attack instead of a sheet they could only flee. Men who had doubted Mara all spring saw it with their own eyes. The line did not magically save the basin. People did that. Crews did that. Tankers did that. Volunteers did that.
But Mara's herd gave them a place to stand. And in fire country, sometimes a place to stand is the whole difference between survival and loss.
By dusk, the main homes on the east side of the basin were still standing. So were Boyd's barns. So was Ruthie's hayshed. So, annoyingly for poetic symmetry, was Dalton Creed's south infrastructure. The valley had not escaped untouched. Fence, outbuildings, grazing ground, plenty was gone. But catastrophe had been cut down to damage. And everybody on Black Divide knew exactly why the outcome had changed. Because a single mother everyone laughed at had spent a year teaching a herd of sick buffalo how to turn dead grass into a fighting chance.
Fires leave behind a strange kind of honesty. Not moral honesty, not immediately. Practical honesty. After Black Divide, no one in Harrow Basin could say Mara's herd was a hobby, a joke, or an emotional mistake. Too many crews had stood on the grazed lane. Too many ranchers had watched the fire behavior change with their own scorched eyes. That didn't mean everybody got noble overnight. It meant the lies got harder to maintain. 3 days after containment, the county hosted an emergency land and recovery meeting at the Grange Hall. People came in work boots and smoke-stiff jackets, carrying notepads, insurance folders, and grudges. Mara arrived late enough to avoid the first round of condolences. Dalton was already there. So was the volunteer fire captain. So was June, Tom, Ruthie, Boyd, half the valley. The county chair opened with damage totals, pasture loss, fence loss, rehabilitation needs, suppression cost. Then a state range coordinator presented preliminary maps showing something nobody in the room was ready to ignore. On properties where Mara's buffalo had grazed targeted corridors, flame spread had slowed enough to alter suppression outcomes. It wasn't folklore anymore. It was mapping. That alone would have shifted the room. But June wasn't done.
She stood and presented Mara's herd health records, grazing logs, water use notes, and restoration data from the previous months. Not as sentiment, as evidence. Ground cover response, fuel reduction strips, moisture retention in wallows, emerging native return in pulse-grazed sectors. Then the fire captain said, "I want it in the minutes that her herd materially improved our hold opportunity at Black Divide." No one corrected him. Dalton rose after that, with his tie loosened and his control frame just enough to show. He tried to shift the conversation toward regulation, liability, oversight, the danger of informal methods becoming county practice without central coordination. Central coordination, by which he meant himself. Then Ruthie Kelm stood up from the third row, ended him. She held a folder in one hand and said, "Before we discuss coordination, maybe we should discuss why Dalton Creed objected to every restoration access permit on the West Draws for the past 2 years." The room changed. Not loudly, clinically. Ruthie had records. Grant applications for invasive fuel breaks, small-scale grazing pilots, shared water improvements. Delayed, denied, or under review so long they died. Each one would have reduced the same fuel continuity that later threatened the basin. Each one had passed through boards where Dalton held influence. Then Boyd added what tanker drivers had said privately for weeks. Creed operations had locked up transport capacity during peak drought while arguing in public that independent water and grazing experimentation created instability. Pattern, not accident. Dalton denied the interpretation. He said he had acted within policy, within business rights, within normal competitive practice. Maybe he had. But the basin had nearly burned inside those rights. And nobody in that room had the stomach to pretend that was abstract anymore. Mara had not planned to speak. Then Eli, sitting beside Tom, with smoke freckles still on his forearms, looked at her with that steady child's face
that always asked the simplest question without words. Are you going to let them tell this without you? So she stood. Not with fury. That would have made it easier for the room to dismiss her as emotion. Instead, she spoke plainly about the auction yard, the laughter, the fever week, the cold breath rising from the basalt, the nurse tanks hauled at midnight, the blocked road, the first green stripes through dead grass, the way the herd moved when pressure was shaped instead of forced. She told them that she had not set out to become a symbol, an example, or anybody's redemption arc.
She had set out to keep 28 sick animals alive because they were not as finished as the experts wanted to believe. Everything after that had come from paying attention to land, to water, to records, to patterns, to the fact that usefulness did not always arrive wearing the clothes people trusted. When she was done, the room stayed quiet long enough to feel like weather. Then the fire captain started clapping. Not because this was a movie, because some truths landed on a room only after danger passed. Others joined him. Not all. Enough. Dalton didn't clap. He left before the adjournment, jaw tight, without shaking a hand. That mattered less than people thought. The real justice was not that he looked beaten. It was that for the first time in the county's memory, Maura Ellison did not need his approval to make the next thing happen. Because the next thing had already started, and it was parked outside her gate by sunrise.
The first truck came at 6:10 a.m., the second at 6:18. By 7, there were 9 ranch pickups outside Mara's place, some dust-coated from long roads, some so clean they looked embarrassed to be there. Eli counted them from the porch like it was a parade nobody had warned him about. Men climbed out carrying coffee, contract pads, feed caps, and expressions too complicated to reduce to one feeling. Pride was still there. So was need. So, in a few of them, was the first awkward shape of respect. Boyd Hanley was first through the gate. He held out a folded paper. "I'd like to book your herd on the West Coulee once you're ready, and I'd like to pay what you ask this time." Mara took the paper, but didn't open it. "Terms changed," she said. He nodded. "I figured." That was the thing about crisis. It corrected market attitudes faster than morality ever did. By noon, Mara had 6 formal requests for fuel reduction grazing hours, 3 inquiries about building temporary water and lane systems, 1 offer from a restoration nonprofit that suddenly wanted to fund portable infrastructure, and 2 calls from outside the county asking if she would consult on targeted buffalo grazing for cheatgrass suppression. A year earlier, people filmed her like a cautionary tale.
Now, they were asking for appointments. Dalton sent no request that first week. Instead, he sent an attorney letter asking for clarification on corridor liability if Mara's herd crossed any parcel touching a historical lease road maintained in part by Creed livestock. Mara laughed when she read it. Then she handed it to Ruthie's cousin, who actually was an attorney and enjoyed nothing more than charging powerful men for slow disappointment. The practical work came first. Mara wasn't interested in fame. She was interested in systems. No grazing without mapped lanes. No emergency moves without water staged ahead. No cheap contracts that treated the herd like blunt instruments. No property access if landowners refused follow-up restoration seeding where needed. No last-minute panic calls during red flag weather unless crews coordinated and everybody respected the animals. And most important, no one moved Bramble's herd without Mara or Tom supervising the front. Every one of those terms existed because she had bled for them. That fall, the county extension office hosted a demonstration day on Mara's ranch. Not a spectacle, not a triumph parade, a field day. Moisture readings, fuel comparisons, grazing maps, seep capture design, wallow microcatchment discussion, animal handling principles, lane widths, portable water placement, real things, useful things.
Exactly the kind of knowledge people often ignored until disaster wrapped it in urgency. June joked that Mara had become the thing she hated most, evidence with scheduling conflicts. Tom just leaned on the rail and told anybody who asked that the buffalo were meaner than theology and twice as useful. Even Dalton's own South lease eventually requested corridor consultation through an intermediary. Mara accepted, with full fees, advance deposit, her timing. She never said no for revenge. She said yes on terms, because terms were what turned survival into power. By winter, the line at her gate was no longer literal every morning. It didn't have to be. The change had settled deeper than traffic. Her ranch books were finally breathing. The SEEP system had been formalized with storage and overflow controls. A grant she had once been told was unlikely got approved in 6 days, now that officials could attach their names to success. Eli had a new inhaler kit, a better pair of boots, and a school science project he was no longer embarrassed to present because "my mom's buffalo changed fire behavior" turned out to be the sort of sentence even teachers stood still for. The herd had changed too. They were no longer the fevered, suspicious cargo from a failed roadside spectacle. They were heavier, quieter in motion, harder in the shoulder, and sure of their routes. New calves kicked through the winter pasture, while Bramble watched from the rise above the seep, one torn ear flicking at snowflies. One evening, almost a year to the day after the quarantine bye, Mara stood alone at the north fence and looked over the dark lane where the first cold breath had risen from the rock. The basin beyond lay silver under moonlight. Somewhere out there were men who still disliked being corrected by a woman, men who would go to their graves calling her lucky because luck sounded better than humility. That was fine. Let them. Land did not care what name men gave truth. Fire did not care either. The spring ran under the basalt with the same steady patience it had held before any of them were born.
The buffalo fed the same way they always had, heads down, purposeful, attentive to what the ground offered and what it needed taken away. Mara rested her hands on the top wire and thought about the auction yard, about the laughter, about the cough of fever in the floodlights, about Eli's map on butcher paper, about the first dark stripe in the grass, about Black Divide and the moment the flames faltered long enough for people to stand. She understood something then that had taken the whole year to become clear. The valley had not been saved by buffalo, not by themselves. It had been saved by attention, by noticing what others dismissed, by respecting instinct without surrendering reason, by doing the slow, unglamorous work before emergency made it fashionable. The buffalo had simply been the blunt, beautiful proof that a different kind of attention could still change an ending. Behind her, the porch light clicked on. Eli stepped out wrapped in a blanket, looked toward the pasture, and said, "You think they knew?" Mara smiled without turning. Knew what? That all those people would need them? She listened to the herd breathing in the dark. "Maybe not that," she said. "But I think they knew where the life was." Eli came to the fence beside her.
Together, they watched Bramble lead the others up the north rise, slow and sure, toward the place where water moved under stone and green held longer than it should. A year earlier, people had laughed when Mara brought 28 sick buffalo home. Now, the basin watched where her herd walked and waited to follow.